think maybe the last sounds better than it is, but I was just listening to what was described in my earlier articles, and look at how much I've learned in 2 days. I heard the words sex offender registration laws, sex offender registration laws. All that has to change. It has to be sex offense laws, registration laws, on the registry. Even my ear, the tin ear, right? That's all going to change. Even though my shoulder is fractured, my heart is full to have all of you here today. I am so gratified that my law school, Janice talked about it, but that my law school not just said yes, they said yes immediately. Well, of course we'll have the conference here. Of course we'll do it for free. And to have the staff work so hard and to see all of you here, it really does fill me with gratitude. And I am so proud of my law review board. I use the word my law review board, who is here. These are the best and the brightest. Law Review is a journal that law schools put out, and this group of students are exceptional. They are not here for credit. They're not here for pay. They have come to support the effort. They have produced 2 of my latest articles, and a couple of them worked on the article last year. So I would like them to stand up so that we can acknowledge them and thank them. I have an expression, one state at a time, one student at a time. I change the minds one at a time, and here we have that future generation. I believe in the rule of law. Perhaps it's an occupational hazard as a law professor. I believe that no matter how messy and organic the law is, no matter if they get it wrong, ultimately they correct their injustices. Ultimately they get it right. That's my basic philosophy. And then the summer of 2003 happened. I was writing an article on statutory rape. I've read thousands of statutory rape cases, and I'm writing an article railing against statutory rape. Don't get me started. So I'm writing this article about how I can't stand this crime, and 2 cases come out from the Supreme Court of the United States at the same time, only a few pages apart. You've heard about one of them at length, Smith v. Doe. And the other one is Connecticut Department of Public Safety, which all of you, even if you don't know the case name, are aware of. Smith v. Doe looked at a 1994 Alaskan registry, as Professor Ellman described, and said it's so benign, and the internet's not really a big deal. This is no different than if people walked down to the courthouse and discovered a conviction. So it's just a civil regulation. And if it's just a civil regulation, that means the 8th Amendment doesn't apply, because it's not punishment. And the 8th Amendment only applies to punishment. Only applies to punishment, and then if it's punishment, we can't change the rules midstream. They call that ex post facto. And we can't have cruel and unusual punishment. But this isn't punishment. Connecticut Department of Public Safety, the Supreme Court said, Connecticut could throw everybody on a public registry. Names, pictures, identifying information. Doesn't matter that they're dangerous or not. And they're allowed to do it without procedural due process because everybody's in the same boat. It was such a devastating blow to me personally to see these 2 cases come out at the same time. I sat back and I said very naively, Professor Ellman would have laughed at me, no, don't worry, I'm going to tell them that this is just wrong. It's a momentary lapse. They're going to listen to me. I'm going to write an article. Justice Kennedy is going to do like the V8 juice. Oh my God, I should have had that V8 juice. Oh my goodness, I was so foolish. So I wrote the article. It's like waiting for the phone to ring, nothing happened. And instead, as the years passed by, starting in 2006 especially, I started to track. The laws got worse and worse. Instead of 8 registrable offenses, which is what it was in 1994, states are up to 35 and 40 offenses that are registrable. Not 10 years registration, now it's 20, now it's lifetime. Residency restrictions, presence restrictions, Halloween restrictions. I heard stories from registrants who felt deep isolation, even deeper sorrow that their country had turned its back on them. No redemption, no rehabilitation, no possibility for hope. And I too lost hope. And then the title would have been No Hope. because I thought this can't be the country that I'm part of. So I did what law professors do. I started to write like crazy. And since 2003, I have been writing like crazy only about sex offense registration laws. When I started to write, I think there were 4 or 5 of us. We probably could have fit into a phone booth. Hardly anybody was talking about it. But slowly, and this is the part that's so important, by 2018, that's not the case. We have got organizations, advocacy groups. We have AXOL, the Dobbs Wire. We have Emily Horowitz sitting in New York. We've got War Against the Registry, Women Against the Registry, WAR, Vicki Henry being here. We have so many people on the ground, not enough yet, but we've got law professors arguing, and it's not just law professors. We have lawyers like Janice, and a round of applause for Janice, please. We have lawyers who are advocating. We need more. But Ira Ellman yesterday talked about firms that are taking pro bono these cases. People ask me all the time when they look at those articles, why are you writing about this? And then quietly they say, surely you have somebody on the registry, don't you? You have a family member. It's okay if you don't want to say. You have a family member, maybe you yourself. And you know what that subtext really is saying? That subtext really is saying, you can't possibly think I'm worthy enough to spend time on. You can't possibly think my issue matters unless you face that issue. Well, that's not true. I don't have anybody on the registry. I didn't have a family member on the registry. I just think that as a law professor, I have an obligation to speak up about injustice. This was the injustice I chose to speak about. And there's many of us, people without. Now I have a lot of friends on the registry. But then when I started, I didn't. And so I am now hopeful. The title of this piece is Hope. You saw my roller coaster ride, but that's okay. And I think what's really interesting is when you think about the theme that's gone through these 2 days, Ira and I, we talked, but we didn't talk about our presentations. It's a similar theme. From 2 different places, we are both seeing hope. So I want to talk about that. I call it Hope 1, Part 2, and Part 3. We've been talking about movements. Bill gave us some great instruction on what movements need to do. Lori Jo gave us great stuff about language about movements. There's a book out called Engines of Liberty by David Cole. It's a marvelous book. It talks about what movements do and how they work. And remember me in 2005 saying, don't worry, I'll tell the Supreme Court it'll all be fine? David Cole says, that's not the way this works. I didn't know that. I needed to read the book. Ira needed to tell me. How does it work? Here's how it works. It's slow. It's incremental. It's 1,000 steps before it ever hits the Supreme Court. Bill said it this morning. We think courts lead, they follow. And what David Cole said is you can't give up. Movements take a long time. We can say desegregation, and if we didn't live during those 30, 40 years, we didn't know all of that to lead up to that. Gay rights movement, push back against AIDS, any of these movements, it takes years. We were talking at lunch, and I think I'm going to butcher the Winston Churchill quote, but I think it's true. I think we may be at the end of the beginning. I think we are now verged on that next step in our movement, and I think that's why we have hope. That's why it's exciting. So before I get to the hopeful part, I got to talk about the part that's not hopeful. We got 904,000 on the registry. Ira's wonderful video yesterday, the last line was, there's over 800,000. And it sort of reminds me of those old McDonald's signs, how many hamburgers are being sold, except those are hamburgers and this isn't hamburgers. It was 850 last year when we got together. We're now at 904. And it's not just 904 because there's more people on the planet. It's 904 because more offenses are deemed to be registrable. More and more crimes are thrown into the registry now. So we have 904,000. And to use Lori Jo's, these are 904,000 that are held accountable, but are redeemable and have redemption. And they deserve housing and employment and love and public support. These are 904,000 people who are treated as a class who aren't getting that. And even if we were going to bust apart, even if we can't abolish the registry, which is what we all want to do, of the 904,000, we've got the empirical evidence that says max 10%, max 90,000 around the country, sprinkled around the country, might be people that the government would want to monitor. Maybe 904,000 who deserve much better than they're getting. Not only them, but their families. We need to talk a lot more about the families that suffer with the registrants, because this is really everybody's in that together. And so the isolation, the stigmatism, that's all happening. So I've got to ask the question. We already know the answer. How do we get here? How do we get to a place where the conversation is so rigid, it's so ugly? How do we get to a place where we release people from prison and still call them monsters? Where kids as young as 9 and 10 are sitting on public registries, some for life. So, we've got residency restrictions. Not only do we have residency restrictions, we've got residency restrictions that make people homeless. And then we blame them for being homeless. How do we get there? Bill mentioned it this morning. We got there because of a moral panic. That's actually a sociological term, moral panic. It's a fear that's wildly distorted and wrongly directed. And when I talk about it some more, I know I'm going to see the nods, because you know we're in the middle of this. And I've now adopted the best words in the world from Lori Jo. This is reptilian brain behavior. So let's look at what's involved in a moral panic. There's 3 characteristics. It's the historian Philip Jenkins who came out with this and called Failure to Launch. Wonderful historian from Britain, and I've had wonderful conversations with him. So here are the 3 characteristics. The first is that there is an official reaction to a person, groups of persons, or series of events that's all out of proportion to the actual threat. And I want to focus on the word groups of persons. Sex offender as a class. Professor Ellman talked about that yesterday. Treating people as a class. Wildly individual, but we need that official reaction to everybody, so we whitewash everybody. And in my 2010 article on legislative epidemics, I talked about why these sweep the country. And there's real reasons that the official reaction goes from state to state to state. It's actually like a disease. It's really like an epidemic or like a virus that it ends up moving. When police chiefs, judiciary, politicians, and editors, Bill talked about newspapers, editors perceive the threat in all but identical terms. They all talk the same language, all on the floors of their House of their Assembly. It doesn't matter if it's California, New York, or Illinois. They're all spouting the same venom. They're all spouting the same words. That's part of the moral panic, the reptilian brain. The third one, when the media representations universally stress sudden and dramatic increases. And we have to hold the media responsible. 2 legal scholars wrote a great article called When They're Planting Stories in the Press. And they tied directly the increase in articles on sex offense crimes and people who had committed them and the increase in the laws. Direct tie. But we don't have to look at that. Do you remember, well, I'm sure you'll remember this, 2010 or 2011, it was the summer of shark attacks. Every week we read about a shark attack. Every single week. Have you heard about a shark attack? No, because the media's moved on. But during that time, that sudden increase, I was worried about my pool. Everybody was worried. There was a shark everywhere. Yes. That's what the media can do. And it's not just newspapers. It's TV shows, Law and Order SVU. It's the TV shows that highlight people, this classification. So that's where we are. That's where we are. We are with this notion. And the central tenet that's the worst, that's absolutely the worst, is this phrase. The risk of recidivism is frightening and high. That's the line from Smith v. Doe. Professor Ellman did such a good job debunking that. But I want to spend a few moments on that phrase, frightening and high, because it goes along with something that Lori Jo was talking about, and that was framing. Language matters, and not just words, language matters. How did this information stick with the public? Why did it stick with the public? It's not true. We know it's false. So why did it stay with the public? There is a great book out called Made to Stick. Two brothers, Chip and Dan Heath at Stanford. They didn't write about sex offense stuff. They instead wrote about other things, advertising, different things in the media. And they wanted to figure out, why do some messages stick and others don't? Why does the public start parroting words and they don't parrot other words? There's 6 reasons that messages stick. I want to highlight 3 here. The statement needs to be simple. It needs to have emotional appeal, and it needs to come from a credible source. Frightening and high are all 3 of those things. Frightening and high, simple statement, you can remember it. Look at the emotional appeal. In fact, in the video, Ira says, it would be horrible if it was high. This is very frightening if it were. It's not true, it's not true, it's not true. But the emotional appeal, now it goes back to Lori Jo's point, the emotional appeal fits into the narrative people are already imagining. If you are fearful, the words frightening and high fit that narrative for you. And the last one, this is the killer. It comes from a credible source. What more credible source than the United States Supreme Court? The United States Supreme Court says it's frightening and high. Oh my God, it's frightening and high. And so court after court continues to adopt it. Part of the reason the Ellman's article on frightening and high, crucial mistakes of the sex crime statistics, part of the reason it is so brilliant is because look at what it did. It knocks out credible source. It actually not just debunked the myth, but it says in beautiful terms, the Supreme Court not only got it wrong, should never have gone down that road. You're relying on this to rely on a pop psychology argument. This is outrageous, and they need another round of applause. So I want to go to Hope Part 1, court decisions. We are seeing movement. We're seeing movement all over the country. And for those of you that don't track that movement, that live in the trenches with your despair, which is our despair and isolation, it doesn't feel like it's happening, but it really is starting to happen. We're feeling change. I said yesterday that for years we never won anything. I used to be grateful if they cited me in an article, even if they didn't use it. I thought, okay, well this is good at least. But now we're actually winning some stuff. So I want to set the groundwork. It's very simple, the groundwork. Professor Ellen called it a checklist. 2 questions a court asks to decide if something's a civil regulation or punishment. Question number 1, what did the legislature intend? Question number 2 is, even if the intent is civil, is the effect punitive? Is it either because there's really no rational purpose to a non-punitive reason, or because it's excessive, then it's punishment. And remember, if it's punishment, we're in 8th Amendment territory and we're off to the races. That's our goal. And we have other goals, but one of our goals is to get into the 8th Amendment. So those are my 2 questions. Did they intend it to be punitive? And secondly, even if they intended it to be civil, when you look at the laws, does it feel like punishment? So here's the thing. You can go into any General Assembly language, go to any history of any state. They're all saying the same thing. Our intent is civil. It is to, that's my voice. It is to protect the community. That's all we're here for. It is not punitive purpose. It is really to protect the community. You go, really? Well, what's your evidence that it works? And even, where's your evidence that there's a rational connection? And maybe if there is a reason for it, maybe you're like so overblown now, it is so excessive. In fact, once they gave the green light, the court gave the green light to the states to do whatever they want, that's what happened. The states, I call it a race to the harshest. Each state tried to make laws that were worse than the other states. They were not just registration schemes, I called them super registration schemes. I can be sticky too. Registration schemes on steroids. And in fact, the Sixth Circuit, they heard that language, that resonated with them. These weren't Alaska registration schemes. This was a bloated, excessive registration scheme. Those are our 2 questions. So, Here's my layperson view on it. It walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck. Guess what? It's a duck. Please stop gaslighting us. Stop telling us it's not a duck. Stop telling us it's a civil regulation. We know, we feel, we experience it. It is, in fact, punishment, pure and simple. We've been saying this for a long time, both in articles, in appeals, and in briefs. And oh my God, we have to take not only comfort, but excitement and celebrate the fact that courts are now starting to hear it. First, they started to hear it in the states. Interestingly enough, Indiana was the first state to call it punishment. You wouldn't think it would have been Indiana, but they were in 2009 with Wallace. It was a state Supreme Court decision. Then there were a few more states. But those of us who track all this say, get over to federal court. We need a federal decision that says it's punishment. And oh my God, quack, quack, quack. Dovie Snyder comes along and says, yeah, it's punishment. And Professor Ellman did a wonderful job yesterday talking about Dovie Snyder. I just want to highlight a few more things. They said it was indeed punishment. And they challenged the assumptions from Smith, but they did it very gently. They did it very nicely because they want the court to see the new framework. This isn't the way it used to look in 1994. Even if you were right, justices, it's so different now. So here's a few things that they are saying. They said that these restrictions, they're called school zones, 1,000 feet from schools. Can't work, live, or loiter. You let that word? Can't work, live, or loiter near a school. You try to find a location in a city where you can actually work, live, or even stand. This is near total banishment. And I want to tell you why that word is really important. Because that word is what the colonial days called punishment. If you were banished, that was punishment. And you know the rest of that story. If it's punishment, the Eighth Amendment's going to apply. So that was good for our team. Then they said, stop telling us that these burdens are minor. Stop saying that registration is nothing. I laughed at that for the following reason. I'm Canadian. And so in my old days, I'm still Canadian, but in my old days of being Canadian, registration meant I filled out a postcard and dropped it in the mailbox. I registered as an alien. My family sometimes thinks I am still, so that's okay. I registered as an alien. That's not what registration looks like now, and we know that's not what registration. So the court comes out, in its opinion, conservative court, and says, stop calling this minor. And just because you say it's minor doesn't make it minor. To have the Sixth Circuit say that, this is huge. Look at the next one. This is the best of all for me. They were really angry at the government. You come into the Sixth Circuit without a bit of evidence, without a bit of empirical data. You say, trust us. This is a civil regulation. It's designed for a rational purpose. Trust us. The other side, our team, came in with empirical study after study after study, had all kinds of experts saying it doesn't work, it's not true, the recidivist rates aren't like this, and the court turned to the government and said, and what's your proof? No, we don't need proof. Trust us. This is all we have to prove to you. And the court said, how dare you come into our court with no evidence? And I want to stop there for a moment, because that's what Lori Jo was talking about. How do we break through to get to the facts? Because it's really about narrative shifting. You have to shift the narrative for the facts to be employed. The Sixth Circuit looked at the facts. And the last is fabulous. What the court said is, after 2003, the states were fat and happy, and they started piling on these laws. But listen, I want you to understand this, Michigan. Smith v. Doe never said, it never gave you a blank check to do whatever you want. Those days are over with now. So that's case number one, Dovie Snyder. I want to talk about why we're so excited out of Colorado. So Dovie Snyder is the Sixth Circuit. Now we've got a hot spot in the 10th Circuit. And this is Millard versus Rankin. Now it's not the Court of Appeals level. Court of Appeals is a higher court. This is a district court, but it's a lifetime appointment by this judge. You can tell this judge is so fed up. And here's the interesting thing about storytelling and opinions. He spends a lot of his pages talking about the plaintiffs, who they are, not about the crimes they committed. He's talking about what life is like on the registry. Not only that, he brought in other people on the registry. I want to hear from you. I want to know what it feels like to be isolated, to be vandalized, to have to keep moving, to lose jobs, being threatened by loss of job. Tell me your stories. This is incredible. Look at what he wrote. I'll read it out loud for those whose eyes are like mine. Registered sex offenders and their family and friends face a known, real, and serious threat of retaliation, violence, ostracism, shaming, and other unfair and, look at the word, irrational treatment from the public, directly resulting from their status as sex offenders. Even the last phrase, status as sex offenders. Quack, quack, this is punishment. Now look at what he does. I mean, we're gonna put a poster up about him. Okay, not only are Colorado's laws punishment, he says, and Colorado's laws aren't the worst in the country. The government kept saying, why are you getting on us? Like, we're better than Michigan. We're way better than Alabama. What are you going after us for, right? It's like the little kid brother, why are you mad at me? Go after the others. He says, not only are they punishment, that gets us into Eighth Amendment territory, I think this is cruel and unusual, right? Yeah. And for those who aren't lawyers in the room, I want to separate out the word punishment. Punishment means if it's punishment, you can't change the rules midstream. You're in the middle of a football game, the refs don't like it's moving too slowly, we're going to move to 3 downs. You don't get to do that in a football game. We're doing that every day with registrants. You go to sleep, it's 10 years, you wake up, it's 20 years. You go to sleep, you have your tier 2, you wake up, you're tier 3. That's ex post facto. But he says not only is it punishment, I'm going to tell you it's cruel and unusual. Like, we can't do a death penalty by firing squad. That's cruel and unusual. We're not going to execute kids. That's cruel and unusual. And I think this is in that same category. Yes, that's very cool, right? He also said what others have been saying, it's a fundamental flaw to have a system that doesn't individualize risk assessment. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said the same thing. She said the same thing on the court. Please pray for her health and her well-being. Continued. And he brought in, as I already mentioned, non-party testimony. And people are mad at that. Well, you can't bring in those other people. They weren't parties to the claim. He says, I want to hear. So he brought in those real stories. And then in his last paragraph, he says, you know what, while I'm at it, I'm really revved up. Oh, I shouldn't do that. It not only hurts the Eighth Amendment, it violates substantive and procedural due process. Boom, I'm done. Yes. That's the 10th Circuit. And I want to talk very briefly about Alabama, because I actually think Alabama case is the true poster child for how horrible registration requirements are. The name of the case is Mcguire versus Strange. It's right now sitting in the 11th Circuit. 3 years it's sitting on appeal. The 11th Circuit hasn't ruled, and I think I have some ideas of why. They're watching what's going on. Michael Mcguire, long story short, committed a sexual assault of his ex-girlfriend in 1984. He went to prison, came out of prison in 88, moved to Washington, D.C., lived a very productive life in Washington, D.C. Hairstylist, jazz musician, got married, 30 years he's there. His brother calls him up in 2010 and says, brother lives in Montgomery, Alabama, can you do me a favor? Come home. I'm starting my law practice, and mom is really ill, and I can't take care of her. And good brother that he was, Michael Mcguire, he and his wife picked themselves up, moved down to Alabama in 2010. He had never been on a registry in his life. Brother says to him, you know, Alabama has some really weird registry laws. Maybe you go down to the police department, tell them your story. You're not on the registry. You want to confirm you're not supposed to be on the registry. Brother had no idea. Michael Mcguire went down, and that day changed his entire life. Michael Mcguire not only went on the registry as a Tier 3 offender, he's now homeless. Homeless, can't live with his wife in the family home in Montgomery, Alabama. He lives under a bridge. Alabama is the most egregious set of laws in the country. There are 115 ways to screw up and violate a registry requirement. 115. So Chief Judge Watkins got this, and private story, I happened to be on a committee with him. I heard this story afterward. He got it from his law clerk. Law clerks write the draft. Law clerk wrote the draft. Alabama laws are fabulous. It's all wonderful. Michael Mcguire has no cause of action, blah, blah, blah. Chief Judge Watkins, a Republican, gets this draft and says, this is outrageous. I'm not sure how much authority I actually have, but I'm going to overturn and create as unconstitutional 2 of Alabama's registry requirements. Tore up the draft, and he wrote his own opinion. Unheard of. Sat home all weekend, he's telling me all this stuff, found my law review article, he's going through all the papers, this is great. He wrote his own draft. He only did 2. It all went up to the 11th Circuit, and the 11th Circuit is waiting. Well, I don't know what they're waiting for. We're waiting to see. So we've got 11th Circuit, 10th Circuit, 6th Circuit, all in the pipeline, so keep fingers crossed. Part 2, legislative changes, and I'll only spend a little bit of time here because you've been hearing about all of them. And Janice, we have board meetings every month, and God bless Janice comes and relates to us what's going on. So the first thing, of course, is the tiered registry. It's a mixed bag for us in California. We want to abolish the registry, but it's important, and it's worthwhile, and it serves and helps part of our community. That's a good thing. Residency restrictions are falling and failing. Hallelujah. And a plug for the Alliance. I like that name, Janice, the Alliance. Plug for Axol. 37 of those residency restrictions that are gone are due to Axol and due to Janice. Thank you, Janice. They're due to Janice and to Carlton, and all those are 37 communities that either because of lawsuit or threats of litigation or just even a warning letter have gotten rid of or reduced or stayed enforcement of the residency restrictions, which is fantastic, and more to come. The third is the media. Bill did such a wonderful job talking about how a movement has to really take care of the media, change the message, think about changing the framing on the media. And I want to talk about a case that Bill brought up earlier. Zach Anderson. Bill mentioned Zach Anderson, 19 years old, lived in Michigan, lived in Indiana, got onto a hookup app, traveled 20 miles to Michigan, and had sex with a girl he thought was 17. The only reason the police found out about it, perfect storm, is the mom was so nervous that she was missing because she was diabetic. And she called the police. The police were sitting in the house. They walk in the door. What were you doing? We had sex, the daughter says. The police arrest Zach. He's 19. She's not 17. She's 14. Don't get me started on statutory rape. He didn't know she was 14, but it's a strict liability crime in that jurisdiction. I've read 1,000 Zach Anderson cases. Why did this one pick up? So Bill mentioned a couple of reasons. First of all, the parents were fearless. They got on Facebook, they went all over, and they had people like fabulous messengers like Bill who brought out the word. But why did it resonate with the public? It resonated with the public not because of statutory rape, but because of the sex offense registry. 61 requirements he had to meet. Couldn't own a smartphone, had to drop his major, which was computer science. He couldn't live at home because he had a 15-year-old brother, couldn't eat in a restaurant that served alcohol, had to be in the house from 9 to 6. Good guys, right? Couldn't talk to anybody under the age of 17, had to plan his trips to the malls. You're hearing the story, right? Everybody got so angry. You know why? Because they looked at that kid and they said that kid could be my kid. They looked at that kid, and that story, that real story, was a sticky message. And then you ended up seeing all these. And I want to point out one of them. Look at the one down towards the bottom, the opinion. When a teen had sex with another teen, a judge tore his family apart. That's a sticky message. We've got to create our own sticky messages. We have to make the narrative about those sorts of things. And in fact, I had the privilege, Lenore Skenazy ran across, somebody sent her my article on throwaway children, and Lenore, just really fighting for kids and the freedom for kids, took my article and turned it into mainstream. I write to courts. She turned my article into mainstream, And my article ended up, look at the titles, Kid Criminals. Kids as young as 9 are on the sex offender registry, ... for life. Nobody can read that title and not be taken by it. Those are the kind of reframing and messaging that we need to do. So that's where we stand. Hope Part 1 is our laws. Hope Part 2 was legislative changes. Hope Part 3 is the media. And here's really Hope Part 4, educating the next generation of leaders about the issue. And Janice and I spoke, and we thought it would be wonderful for you to be able to hear from one of our law review members, a person who worked on my last year's article that some of you picked up, to see her thoughts about it. So I asked Jessie to come on up.
First things first, I want to thank Professor Carpenter for giving me this platform. I feel very inadequate standing up here. I think that I'm still very much learning about all of this, and so I apologize if anything I'm going to say sounds deeply ignorant, but I think learning is a painful process, as Professor Carpenter knows. I think when I read her article in the process of doing the editing for the law review, there are 2 points that really stick in my mind about reading it. The first is that as a student of the law, there are 2 things that I noticed about it. The first is thinking about what it means for the law to create identities, for the law to erase action and to erase nuance and complexity about a person and to create a label. And that's really what the registry does, and that's really what made me a little bit hopeless about studying the law, because it is such a categorical discipline. It's about saying, this is this and it's not that. This is this and it's not that. Because that's how the law works. And sadly, in sex offense registration laws, you could see essentially the worst version, or that kind of philosophy taken to its worst limits. The second is that I think I've recently become aware, sex offense has been one, cash bail. And those are 2 things that I've been thinking about, because they are things that are designed, as Professor Carpenter mentioned, and intended as community protection. They're supposed to be about assessing, an individual assessment, which doesn't actually exist, assessing whether or not somebody is dangerous or not, and bail is supposed to be preventing that. But they have, through mass hysteria, been warped into punitive tools. And I clerked for, I didn't clerk, I externed for a central district judge, and I saw many, many times bail being used against somebody who was not dangerous at all. But there are guidelines that need to be followed, and a lot of people don't have the economic means to pay bail. And so bail then becomes a punishment. So that's the first part of kind of what I was grappling with when I started reading this. And the second part, I think, is something that Professor Carpenter mentioned, is I guess the human aspect of the story, which is that, as Professor Carpenter mentioned, when she started doing this kind of work, people would ask her, you must have somebody on the registry. You can't just be impartial about this. And I think that a lot of the work that we need to do as human beings, and I think especially in this country, even though I'm not from this country, is to really kind of redefine what empathy means. Empathy is not about sameness. Empathy is about a recognition in the other that something is important to the other in the same way that something may be important to you. It is not the same thing as what you are going through. And so I think because to me that's what that statement really indicates, that you have to go through the same exact thing to understand what another human being is going through. And that's not what empathy is. It's about recognizing the other in his or her otherness. And I think there are many people sitting in this room, I can never claim to have any understanding of what their lives have been being a registrant. But that doesn't mean that I can't help, and that doesn't mean that I can't attempt to understand. Language and words and things like this are the only tools that we have to attempt to reach across the aisle and understand what it is to live in somebody else's shoes. And so I think for me, that was inspiring, that Professor Carpenter had taken on a project where she didn't have any kind of personal investment, because to me, that's really what I want to end up doing with my life, is to like help other people and to have an effect on other people's lives, even on the lives of people that I could never truly begin to fully understand in all of its complexity. And so I think those for me were kind of the two main lessons that I got from it. And I think a lot of it has to do with framing and the way that we think about things. And a lot of it has to do about our attempt, again, to look at categories of people instead of actual human beings. Because once you're called a registrant, and this is what the registry does, it brands you. It's a branding. And that kind of branding has been consistently, historically used to marginalize people. It's about placing it, whether it is a medical diagnosis or a legal category, it forces people to essentially not look at another person, but just look at a label. And the work that's being done here today is fundamental work, really, for me to even be in the room with you guys and speak to you, to know that there are people behind those names and there are people behind those labels. Thank you.
My shoulder is still fractured, but my heart is even fuller after that. That was absolutely wonderful. Educating one mind and one state at a time. The last 2 years, I've finished my presentations with a silly video, but the silly video has meaning. It's how movements are created. I want to play it for you. We're then going to have some time, which I've designed, because this is the last plenary session, and I see that my other plenary folks are in this room, and this would be the last opportunity really to ask questions of anybody in this room. So Bill and Ira and Lori Jo, you thought your gig was over with? It's not. So I want to play this. Here we go.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. Stand out and brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. A first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut, and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers, because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is over-glorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit. You saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. find a lone nut doing something great. Have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
The beauty of this conference is we have so many shirtless dancers and so many first followers and second followers and third followers. Bill is right, we need more people, and pretty soon we're going to look like that hillside over there. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.